Good morning, everyone. I'm Bridget, and I have with me today, I've asked Ray Milner to join me because he's one of the principal planners that's worked on urban ag ordinances over the past couple years, and also because I just got braces and I'm having a really hard time speaking, so he'll be my interpreter in case you don't understand anything that's going on. So I want to start out by telling you a little bit about how Salt Lake City got started talking about, okay. I want to start out by talking a little bit about how Salt Lake City got started talking about food policy. It all started back when Mayor Becker was running for his first term. He ran on the platform that sustainability was going to be the center of all of his policy and program decisions. So what does that really mean when we talk about sustainability incorporated into all these things? What it means is that we're going to look at creating initiatives that are going to contribute to a healthier quality of life for our current residents without compromising the quality of life for our residents in the future. So we're looking at a lot of different policies and programs that are going to contribute to creating a more vibrant and resilient community in Salt Lake City. So that can be anything from conservative use of energy, homegrown businesses, wise use of resources, energy security, land preservation, and smart use of government dollars. But a key component of that is our local food system. How are we accessing food? Where is it coming from? Is it healthy? This is a big contributor to how our community is and how we can help it to continue to grow in a healthy and sustainable way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ray to start talking about what that means in terms of planning.
So I'm a low talker, so if you can't hear me, raise your hand or whatever. But can you hear me now? No? Now? Oh, if you can't hear, this is as loud as I go. If you can't hear me now, you'll have to move up. So sorry. But when Mayor Becker, like Bridget was saying, one of the primary components of his initial campaign was the sustainability and the livability. And like when he was campaigning, or after he actually took office, he established 10 issues that he wanted to address during his term. There was recycling, transportation, air quality, urban agriculture was the one that I was assigned to work on, as well as solar and wind. And there were, I don't know, a couple others. I think, what was it? It was livability and living diversity in housing units and things like that. And so I was assigned to work on the urban agriculture component. And so the way that the mayor initiated it was that he, we can do that, is that he hired a consultant. And you know how consultants are, like if you've ever worked with a consultant, they're kind of like a hurricane. They blow into town, a lot of things get moved around, and then they kind of blow away, and everybody's kind of left, to kind of figure out what happened. And so the consultant that was hired came in, and they had a general overview and a general plan for what they wanted to see with the urban agriculture. But the problem was that the ordinance and the regulations that they gave us really didn't fit into our ordinance and the way we do things. And so what we had to do as a staff was take what they gave us and kind of pare it down and apply it to Salt Lake City. And so we went through it, we rehashed it, we rewrote it, we argued, we rewrote it again, then we argued some more, we rewrote it again. And then finally, what we did was we started involving some of the key players. And this was fantastically beneficial to us because in bureaucracy, like with the as a city planner, sometimes we get stuck in a vacuum and we start focusing on, well, what if this happens? What if, the guy's driving the tractor down the street and, there's mud flying everywhere and that's a disaster and it just can't happen. So we got to write a rule for that. And what if, they start growing tomatoes or potentillas that grow over the fence. So we got to write a rule about, we were coming up with all these different kind of rules. And so when we called in the Department of Agriculture and Wasatch Community Gardens, other city departments, and a few other people from, state and local agencies, they took one look at what we'd written and they were kind of horrified. They were like, nobody will ever grow another tomato in the city as long as we live. The ag guy, I think you probably know him. I think his name is Tom. Is it Tom Williams? He was like, the last thing we want is for you guys to get involved, because we've been operating under the radar for years and years, and everything's worked out just fine, and now you come in to like save the day and you're screwing everything up. And so we had to kind of make some modifications to the ordinance again and kind of look at realistically, what are the issues, and so we made some changes. And then after that, we kind of opened it up to the public, and we started having public hearings and just inviting people to come and comment. And what we found was we had this massive urban agriculture subculture in Salt Lake City that most people don't know about. We had all these people showing up to our public hearings with, wearing rubber boots with dirt under their fingernails, and, with a lot of the what ifs and the what fors and what about this. Like one person came in and said, well, what I do is I rent out people that don't want to landscape their backyard. I rent out the backyard and I raise vegetables, and then we use it in the co-op. And we're like, oh, we never thought of that. And another person came in and said, well, I've got this ratty old house and we want to tear it down and create a community garden. And one of our regulations in the ordinance is that we want to preserve our housing stock at all costs, because we don't want to lose the people that we have in the city. We want to keep our housing so that we can keep our people. And so we had to kind of have a lot of political wrangling about, well, we want community gardens too, but we don't want to lose people. And so we came up with a regulation that says, well, you can tear down one house for a community garden, but you can't tear down more than that, because the fear was a developer comes in and says, wink, wink, nod, nod, I'm going to tear down these 5 houses and put in a community garden and then land bank it for a few years and then build like something the city doesn't want. And so we had a lot of the back and forth with that. And then finally, the city council adopted an ordinance for us that was very different than what we came up with before. What we did was, originally it was just an urban agriculture, and it was all inclusive. And it ended up, we broke it into community gardens into one subsection, urban farms into another subsection, and then farm stands into another subsection. And each one of those, we created about 5 or 6 little rules for it with regard to, how they could operate, where they could operate, and just making sure that we mitigated impacts onto the neighbors. I guess I could go through some of the rules. I don't know if that would be interesting for you, but it's not very interesting for me. We haven't had, in Salt Lake, that off the top of my head, I can't think of a permanent farm stand that we have in the city, like, kind of like on the Fruit Highway or something up in Willard. But most of what we have are temporary structures, and the ordinance was designed for temporary structures. So it would, yeah, right. And that's actually a good question, like, because what we would probably do is we'd transfer you to a permanent structure, and you'd probably get, you'd still get the half-inch packet. We never claim to be perfect, but yeah, the roads, well, like a roadside stand where you come up and you have like a trailer, or if you just set up like a little permanent or little pop-up tent or something, that's what ours was written for. And it's a permitted use. The way we wrote it was it's a permitted use there is a business license requirement. And if you put it on property that's not your own, you need to have permission from the property owner. Yeah. And then you just, as long as you have permission from the property owner, and then we had a couple of rules that, you know, the food has to be maintained in a safe, you know, vermin-free, you know, without bugs. And then we had some setback requirements. You have to be about 10 feet back from the sidewalk so that you could give yourself a queuing area for people and stuff like that. But that was, yes, ma'am. The other cities, this is just for Salt Lake. The other cities, I'm not sure what they've done at this. I haven't. You can tell. Go ahead.
So,
oh, I have very few people under me. I'm just Salt Lake. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, well, there's, I mean, the way the local government is set up, like I'm from the city proper, and so each city would have someone who probably either, well, what I found was, in the county as well, what I found was there wasn't a lot of information out there with the cities and the planners and everybody else, because this is kind of a new thing as far as like, as far as regulations go. It's been going on for a long time, but as far as like the city being involved in it, it's pretty new. And so if you call like the guys in Murray or the people in Sandy, or the county's been pretty proactive, but most cities don't have a very good handle on what should happen. And that's kind of what the problem was with us when we started in on this process, is like we were just throwing rules at things and like, oh my gosh, this is, you know, what are we going to do? And like what it ends up being is it's like, well, people have had gardens since the beginning of time, so it can't be that bad. And, you know, and so we kind of had to, you know, readjust our thinking as, you know, as the rule makers, because, you know, that's kind of what we do. And so we, yeah, generally when we adopt a new ordinance, we have a couple of years and stuff starts popping up. Like, for example, the other day we had, there's a church that's supposed to be demolished over on the west side. And this is kind of unrelated, but it is related. And the city council adopted a new demolition ordinance that says you can't tear down a building unless you have a use that is approved to replace the use. And that's to prevent vacant lots like the sugar hole that just sat there for 4 years or whatever. And so what the developers have done is they found a loophole, as they say, oh good, we're putting in a community garden. And you know they don't have any intention of doing that. So now the demolition ordinance is going to be reviewed, and this ordinance will probably be reviewed as well. Like, you know, there'll probably be some rule that the garden has to stay in operation for a year or something. You know, there'll be a review of something. We'll have to figure that out. And so it's always kind of one of those no good deed goes unpunished type of scenarios that we have. And so there's always revisions to the ordinance, and there's always modifications. We call it fine tuning, where, you know, everything from like we made a typo when we wrote it to, we really didn't want it to say you shall do this. It should say maybe you can do this, or, you know, or all that kind of stuff. So anyway, Bridget has Food Policy Task Force here for us. So
thanks. And I'll just go through the Food Policy Task Force really quickly, because at the time that we were doing this ordinance review, At the time we were doing ordinance review, we were pulling stakeholders in from all over, and we were having more and more conversations around food policy. We were trying to figure out more about food programs and what that looks like. And the more that we talked about it, the more we realized, or the less we realized we knew. So at that time, Mayor Becker created the Food Policy Task Force, where we brought a diverse group of organizations and agencies to the table to really start helping us prioritize how do we create a more sustainable local food system. What do we need to do as a city to help more local food production happen, to increase access to healthier foods for all of our residents? and we brought people from all different arenas of the food system, from production to distribution to consumption and even food waste. And they were really key in helping us identify some of the barriers with these ordinances. And as Ray mentioned, we went through this whole process of looking at maybe we need to have all these rules all the way to the other end, where we were like, let's just get government out of the way and figure out how to empower people as much as possible to grow their own food, because it's not that big of a deal. So now we're going to go into a little bit where we're talking about the different ways that we've defined urban agricultural uses and what that means for Salt Lake City. And I'll turn it back over to Ray for a bit to talk about urban farming.
Keep the microphone thing going here. So anyway, we touched on this a little bit, but the first one we defined was urban farming. And urban farming would be defined basically as someone who is doing is using a farm, or is farming for profit. So if you're farming the collectives, and the guy that grows vegetables and then sells them to the restaurants, or the gal that I told you about who was renting out or planting in people's backyards, and then so if you're doing anything for profit, then you fall under this urban farming category. And the rules that we created were essentially to mitigate what it boiled down to is, after we got through it, we just wanted to mitigate any issue that you would have with your neighbor. If you were growing in your backyard and you were fertilizing and there was a big hue of fertilizer flying over, or pesticides or something like that, I assume most people are organic, so it doesn't apply to them, but occasionally, you might have somebody doing that, so we have rules for that. We set up rules for having an on-site farm stand, so that if an individual did want to have an excess and they did want to sell it, you could sell your stuff, set up a little stand in front of your house and sell a few kumquats or whatever. And then we expanded the farm stands. And it sounds like we need to expand it a little more for electricity. You could create a temporary farm stand, but like, you mean like build a building on the vacant lot? Yeah, but not a building, just like a shed. Yeah, like a shed. Yes, you could. I'd have to get into like the real nuances of the ordinance to figure out how permanent your shed could be, because at some point what we'd do is we'd be looking at, well, it depends on the zone as well. If you were in a residential area versus a commercial area, that would make a difference. So there's a lot of gray area for that. Well, right now the way the ordinance is written is that it'd have to be a temporary structure. Yeah, a tent or something. But that's one of those modifications we were talking about that we could look at. Yeah, you'd have to have like an extension cord from the neighbor's house or something. Yeah. Yeah, that's what would be. That's kind of what we expected. So, yeah. And it's not very sustainable either, is it? Yeah, that's true. Yes, ma'am. If you grew the produce on your property, yes, you'd be fine. If you were like buying vegetables for someone else and then trying to make a profit off of it, that would start to get into the gray area. But if it's like you got some extra tomatoes and a few carrots, go nuts. So the next category we created, the next thing that we did was we worked on an accessory structure ordinance and the home occupation ordinance. The accessory structure ordinance was designed primarily for hoop houses and greenhouses, and our rules for lots. We have, in most residential zones in Salt Lake City, you're required to leave 60% of your lot as open. And this is a rule that was created in order to kind of generate a little urban open space so that everybody could have kind of a yard and some open feel for the streets and whatnots. And it's kind of the historic development pattern of Salt Lake City. And what that'll get you on a 5,000 square foot lot is approximately, I think it's like 2,200 square feet of coverage, which would include your house and your garage. And that generally takes up most of your square footage on your buildable area on your lot. And so what we did was we exempted out the hoop houses, the greenhouses, and the the low tunnels. So if you wanted to put a greenhouse on your lot and you're maxed out, you're still good to go. If you want to put up a little hoop house or one of those little doohickeys that the low tunnel, yeah, go nuts. And so that was a benefit for the growers as well. And the controversy for this one came when we started working with the historic district, because the historic district puts a lot of emphasis on preserving the streetscape and the look and the feel of the houses as they are and as they were. And so they don't want to have a whole lot of stuff new stuff cluttering up the old stuff. And so that was kind of a give and take with the Historic Landmark Commission, but they did eventually end up allowing them even in the front yard with a little height exception. So you can't put up a 30-foot greenhouse or something, but I think it was 7 or 8 feet that they're allowing for a hoop house or something in the front yard. So that was a big concession from the historic group. And then the other thing that we did was a home occupation ordinance. And the home occupation, that's a license that you get to operate a business from your home. So the lawyer that operates out of his house, the accountant, you'll see them, they're operating out of their house. There's a whole list of things that you can do, and urban farming and urban agriculture was added to that list so that people could sell from their own home, or so that people could use their home for the collectives, like when people come in and pick up the produce at the guy's house when they grow it out in Davis County or whatever. So they could use those, they could take advantage of that. So we could make those uses legal so that people wouldn't have any problems. What's next? The next one that we did was community gardens, and community gardens are the poster child in Salt Lake City for community gardens is Wasatch Community Gardens. We created the rules. Basically, at the time, Claire Uno was in charge, and so she and I sat down and we basically created rules designed with them in mind. There was a lot of discussion about allowing animals in the community gardens. One of our city councilors wanted to allow goats and sheep and stuff like that, but we drew the line at chickens because we figure if the goat gets out of the shed and eats all the tomatoes, it's kind of counterproductive. So, plus, we didn't want kids, if you leave a goat there at night or something. I don't know, as a teenager, I would have loved that because it would have ended up at, who knows where that thing would have ended up. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, right now the discussion is they've drawn the line at the chickens. There has been, that one city councilor, he would like to see it. The problem that we have with the larger animals is that most of our lots are pretty small and it's hard to support a sheep or a goat or a pig or a horse on 1,000 square foot backyard or something. And so what happens, because you'd have to feed it, so where do you store your hay or your grain and all that kind of stuff? And then all of a sudden that starts drawing in the mice and the rats and stuff. And so we're still kind of trying to figure out how that would work. And so right now we haven't done anything on it. Well, there was the discussion at the time was centered around, how much is too much and so on and so forth. And so the rule kind of came in where it did. But I think that again would be along like what we were talking about a minute ago, is that after a year or so, if we look and, we're not being overrun by, because the the problem is always like, oh my gosh, if we let go of this rule, or if we increase the square footage, we're all going to be overrun by hoop houses, and so there, it's kind of, it's that way with everything, so you kind of like we kind of mitigate, we say, well, if we only allow it on, X amount of square footage or whatever, then it won't be that bad. And so what happens is after a couple of years, if we're not overrun by hoop houses, then if someone comes in and says, hey, I'd love to have, a bigger hoop house, then people are more amenable to it. It's kind of it's a baby step thing. It's the Bill Murray thing. Well, you mean the coverage rule? Yeah, it's a rule that was written primarily because they're trying to preserve, one, the historic value of our neighborhoods, because most of our neighborhoods are 50 to 60 years old at least, and they were traditionally built, the house on the lot with a garage behind. And so a lot of people really value that kind of makeup of our neighborhoods. And so the rule was created in order to preserve that feel of our neighborhoods. So it's an aesthetic thing. And also to preserve yards, front yards and backyards, so people can have a place to run around. And so that's why the rule was written. But now kind of, I think you can kind of see with like the newer generations that those kind of things aren't as important. With like, college kids and stuff, they want to live in like an apartment downtown or whatever, as opposed to a third of an acre lot out in the suburbs. You're seeing that change. And so the rules are kind of, they're always about 5 years behind kind of, go ahead. Well, this comes in like with Mayor Beck, what we talked about originally was Mayor Becker's sustainability initiative was to kind of change those philosophies. And, and he had his 10, and water conservation actually was one of his 10, I didn't mention it, but it was one of the 10 components that he has. And we're working on an irrigation ordinance right now. And so, but these kind of things always take a long time to, it's like turning a battleship or something. It doesn't just like, spin around and away you go. It takes a long time. The elected officials, they hear from people. I assume I'm speaking to the community garden crowd here. There's not a lot of, anti-community garden people here, but the elected officials do speak to a lot of people who are like, oh, it looks awful, in the fall, you just got dead weeds and blah, 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 and the grass is so much nicer and so on and so forth. So it's hard to just like all of a sudden say, okay, we're switching and everybody can, so that's kind of, I don't know if that's a tremendous explanation, but okay. So anyway, the community gardens, the rules are actually very similar for the community garden as they are for the agriculture, but it's just we created that separate category because the community garden can just go nuts. You don't have to get a business license. It's just for people to enjoy, who live in an apartment or whatever, and they want to hang out and have friends and get their hands dirty. And then, let's see, oh, this is you, Bridget.
So as we were going through this process to look at ordinances and figuring out how to support excuse me, these different initiatives, we were getting a lot of requests from residents to start community gardens. And there was nothing set up for us to figure out how to evaluate these requests. So we would get people bringing us lots and they're saying, this lot is vacant, we want to put a community garden here. And we would go look at that lot and it wouldn't have a water hookup. There actually, it might have been an old gas station or something. So we figured that since the requests were coming in, we better figure out a way to start evaluating areas because we've now said that food production is a priority, so we want to support that. So we created an interdepartmental steering committee to start looking at how do we want to evaluate requests and realize that if we took a step back and looked at our own inventory, we should start by identifying parcels or properties that we know of, that we own, that have water hookup already, that have great direct sunlight, that are located in a community that would have a need for a community garden. So we looked at 8 different properties. We followed the county's lead in looking at community gardens and parks. And we identified 8 different properties within parks that would be ideal for community gardens. And as we're going through that process, we're also, this is another point about how we're always reevaluating these ordinances, because we realized that of all the places that we did allow for community gardens, we did not allow for them in open space. So we're currently doing an ordinance amendment where gardens would be allowed in parks. And as soon as that is approved, which should actually be this month, we'll be able to move forward with these 8 properties, and we'll be trying to do 2 new community gardens a year and have budget allocated for water meters so that these community gardeners can just jump right in and start working on the other infrastructure without the water meter being a barrier. As you're well aware of, that can be a huge expense as people are moving forward.
But this was an ordinance that was created about 3 or 4 years ago. And just a little history for why bees and chickens and things weren't created. I think this is another one of those changing philosophy things. Is back in the 40s and 50s, I think a lot of the people that moved into the cities were moving in from farms, and it was kind of like, well, and so a few years ago, when the groundswell came back, kind of circled back, we created an ordinance for the bees as well as for the chickens. And so the rules with the bees are that you're able to have 5 hives on most lots in the city. There might be 1 or 2 half-acre lots in the city for a residential, but most of them are smaller than that. So you're going to have 5 hives. The general rules are that you need to keep them in the rear yard. You need to maintain them. You got to have a water source. I guess bees need a good water source. And then you need to establish your hives so that the flight pattern stays away from people. I didn't know that you could do that, but apparently you can. So those are the general rules. And then there's a 10-foot setback from the neighbor, so you don't. Let's see. Honeybees shall be kept in hives with removable frames, which will be kept in sound and usable condition. And then you got to be operated and maintained as provided in the Utah Bee Inspection Act. So that's all it says on that. And then chickens. So chickens, you're able to have 15 with no roosters. So there's not a lot of poor old roosters are kind of cut out of the ordinance. I know. I was not very happy. I think you got to go down to IFA every spring and restock, I guess. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, that'd be the county. We're very liberal with our hens. You get 9 more. So, and then, we have some coop requirements, and the coop has to be, 2 square feet per chicken. So we're out there, measuring the 2 square feet. I'm sorry, you dropped a little short. And then you got to keep them in the rear yard, and then the other requirement is that you got to keep your coop in usable condition. So when the raccoon comes up out of the gully and attacks your chicken coop like it did my neighbor's house the other day, you've got to have a good fencing and stuff on there so that he doesn't get them. So pretty much that's what we have in the city for our rules as far as urban agriculture and urban farming goes. So our rules are on our website. Also, if you have questions or concerns, you can call me. If you want, I can give you my number. My number's 801-535-7645. So feel free to call if you have any questions, or if you have some comments or problems that you're having. Because the goal is to make urban farming easy and user-friendly in the city without having huge impacts on neighbors. And so hopefully, if we have something that's egregious or whatever, you can let us know, and we can try to fix those things. Then and Bridget has a bunch of other stuff, but before I finish, we do have one thing that we're working on right now, and it's planting in the park strips. And the park strips are that little stretch of area between the edge of curb on the street and the edge of the sidewalk. Usually in the city there's about, I don't know, 8 or 10 feet of, it's just grass usually. And right now you're allowed to plant anything that you want in the park strip, but there's a height limit. So it's about 30 inches. And the reason that we have the 30-inch height limit is safety. So like if you're backing out of your driveway, you can see over the plants for cars coming, and also if you're pulling in, you can see over the plants if there's someone walking on the sidewalk. I mean, that's essentially why we have the rule. But there's been some discussion about eliminating that height rule in order to grow taller plants. And so that's kind of in front of the city council right now, and we're kind of going back and forth over whether or not these safety concerns outweigh the right of a person to grow tall. Because you can, when you set up your tomato plants, you can get them pretty high. I can't, but other people can. And like corn will get pretty high and stuff like that. So, you can't, and then there's other people that do like aesthetic planting, like the sunflowers and stuff. And so it can get pretty high. And so we're kind of having those discussions. So if you have any comment or input on that, you can call me and let me know as far as that goes as well. Oh, sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, there's some talk about that, and that goes with what Bridget was talking about with the open space. Right now, I don't think there's a big incentive for the city to allow that at the moment. I guess it would be just an ongoing discussion. A lot of those, actually, like the 6 South one that you're talking about is actually the historic people guard that pretty closely because it's historically significant, those medians with the, like, there's the, what is it, the cedar. That's another thing that we've talked about, and it's ongoing. Bridget is involved in that a lot more than I am. Maybe you are.
Well, it's kind of, no, I mean, yeah, we would need a legal interpretation for that. I don't think anybody's out there enforcing that one. You're obviously you're taking care of it. It's a kind of a agreement between you and the city.